On behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to the annual Arnold Band Distinguished Lecture in Jewish Studies. This year, we are highlighting Professor Eli Bromberg and his recent work, Unsettling, Jews, Whiteness, and Incest in American Popular Culture. His book is available through Rutgers University Press and wherever books are sold. We'd like to thank you for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for these virtual events. Eli Bromberg completed his PhD in English and American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2017. His research and teaching interests include Jewish American popular culture, sexual anti-Semitism, Jewish American literature, and incest studies. He has taught at Fordham University, the University of Hartford, Hofstra University, Mount Holyoke College, and UMass, and has been published in the Forward, Ingeveb, Shofar, and Studies in American Jewish Literature. And now I'll turn it over to you, Eli, to introduce your book.
Thank you, Ben, for that introduction and for taking the time to read the book and talk with me about it. I'm very excited for this opportunity. This is my first talk about Unsettling, and so it's been an opportunity for me to revisit the ideas I set forth for the first time with a bit of distance. And I'm grateful to you and your colleagues at UCLA and the Levy Center. Getting the invitation from Chelsea in the fall was an absolute highlight during what was such a difficult 2020. I'm also indebted, as I talk about this book, to the mentors and colleagues who provided invaluable support and guidance as I wrote and revised it. It's not an exhaustive list, but I am in debt of my editor at Rutgers, Elizabeth Maselli, my dissertation committee at UMass, Randall Noper, Laura Briggs, and Josh Lambert, and Kat Yedibel-Mavorach and Ben Schreier, who reviewed and provided invaluable comments on the manuscript. The errors are mine, of course, but where the book succeeds, it's thanks to their and others' generosity and insight. Unsettling grew out of a dissertation I wrote in English and American Studies. The book attempts to describe the power dynamics that facilitate instances of prominent white Jewish men who are alleged of, deny, or even confess to incestuous sexual transgression, being cast as sympathetic figures, whether that takes place in various genres of fiction or in popular news coverage or scholarship. Among the primary arguments I make is that Jewish community protective politics play a role in protecting the image of white Jewish masculinity, and that this transpires because of a very real history of sexual anti-Semitism and a Jewish incest stereotype in particular, which Jewish men were historically quite vulnerable to. The fact that the Jewish incest stereotype, which has lateral and vertical components, is not frequently discussed as a salient Jewish stereotype, unlike, for example, controlling the media, being cheap or being good with money, etc., speaks to it having a muted presence in mainstream popular culture. But this also speaks to its taboo quality and the manner in which whiteness operates for white Jews in American society. It's a stereotype that has been, I argue, somewhat actively, if not necessarily intentionally, displaced onto other marginalized groups, onto Black men and Black families, as I argue in my chapter on second wave feminist criticism of Freud, and onto white non-Jewish working class or poor families, as I argue in my chapter on Roseanne. This idea of Jewish community protective politics is not a new idea, but perhaps a new way to frame dynamics that can be difficult to discuss in an intracommunal fashion, as well as in a broader context. In some ways, it's an attempt to frame how Jewish exceptionalism functions when a Jewish man is accused of individually embodying an anti-Semitic stereotype, but with an eye towards emphasizing that Jewish exceptionalism privileges some Jews over others. Jewish community protective politics refers to an impulse and unorganized practice within the Jewish community of protecting the image of Jewish masculinity by denying allegations of specific Jewish male wrongdoing, or alternatively, in the face of overwhelming evidence, denying or obscuring the Jewishness of a Jewish man alleged of that wrongdoing, what I refer to as a form of secular excommunication. Jewish community protective politics then don't actually serve to protect members of the Jewish community because the interests of, for example, Jewish children or Jewish women who are the victims of abuse, or quite importantly, non-Jewish children and non-Jewish women are disregarded in order to protect the image of the abuser. I should note that Amy Newseen's important collection, Tempest in the Temple, addresses some of these dynamics in religious Jewish context, while my project is organized far more in terms of popular culture and Jewish figures who are considered far more secular, if still recognizably Jewish. In the book, I describe how these dynamics function in a set of cases involving iconic Jewish figures involved in incest narratives. The first involves Jewish second wave feminist critiques of Freud in the 1970s, and the subsequent ones center on the 1990s. Roseanne Barr's allegations of her father's sexual abuse and the incest meta-narratives on Roseanne. Media coverage of Dylan Farrow's allegations of Woody Allen's incestuous abuse, as well as Allen's relationship with Sonia Farrow. A close reading of how Allen includes what I refer to as incest Easter eggs in his post-1991 films, and an examination of Henry Roth's second novel, Mercy of a Rude Stream, which contains a pseudo-confession to sibling incest, but whose manuscript revision history also reveals a pseudo-confession to raping an 11 or 12-year-old first cousin. In building my analyses, critical race theory has been vital to unpacking how race and whiteness inform the manner in which the tellings of these stories displace incest stereotypes onto ostensibly non-Jewish groups, as well as to how Jewish community protective politics inevitably privilege white male Jewish members of the community above more vulnerable individuals. In conducting these analyses, I depart from a fairly straightforward assessment of white Jews as white Jews, as opposed to, quote, off-white or, quote, conditionally white. I do this largely because the project requires it, and because I believe any frank reckoning with American Jewish history and culture require it, and also because any attempt to counter white supremacy requires a framework that understands white Jewishness and other, quote, ethnic white identities as not merely occupying this between space that has been theorized regarding the distinctions between white and non-white. Instead of focusing on this idea of between, I think it's instrumental to think of white Jewishness as constitutive of whiteness, a manner of being white and articulating white identity that plays a role, along with other white ways of being, in propping up whiteness, and thus inevitably white supremacy. Just as combating white supremacy requires more attention to the particular ways that white Jews can occupy whiteness, combating the patriarchal dynamics that facilitate men getting away with sexual abuse requires more attention to the specific cultural logics attending to how individual stories of abuse or denials of abuse are reported. And so this project suggests that activists and scholars and survivors need space to discuss phenomena that are otherwise rarely considered appropriate for broad public conversation. And where it involves Jews being accused of sexual transgression, history suggests activists, scholars, and survivors need access to identifying and discussing phenomena that might presently be considered anti-Semitic to even suggest. For example, that Woody Allen intimated in press conferences and interviews that Dylan Farrow's allegations of his sexual abuse were actually evidence of an anti-Semitic campaign against Allen is a crucial and underexplored aspect of how Woody Allen influenced media coverage that helped him to avoid consequences for the acts Dylan Farrow alleged him to have committed. It is unfortunate but inevitable and part of the human condition that men who are Jewish will commit incestuous sexual abuse in the future, just as men who are not Jewish will commit such abuses. But these men may rely in some part on strategies not unlike what Woody Allen utilized among his tools for generating sympathetic media coverage. My hope is that my book helps to carve out more spaces for these kinds of observations and conversations, which may help reveal and even deconstruct some of the white and male privilege that these abusers often hold.
Thank you so much, Eli. And I have to say, I really, really enjoyed reading this book, both in general and also in particular, as it pertains so much to some questions that I think about around race and Jews, and it's also anti-Semitism, right? So how these sorts of, and especially whiteness, that they create this kind of complex matrix. But I want to start by asking you to speak a bit more about your methodology and conceptualization of Jewish whiteness. What I found so refreshing about your work here, as you just mentioned, was that you sort of do take for granted Jewish whiteness as a sort of non-problematic combination, right? You're not really interested in terms like white passing or something similar. You just mentioned this between space, but you rather simply assert the reality of white Jewishness. And then your investigation even traces some of the processes that such a combination of whiteness and Jewishness or even a particularly ethnic Jewish form of whiteness was reified, right? So how those processes, right, sort of made Jewish whiteness into something. And because it really is refreshing and does seem distinct from so many studies that begin from sort of tracing a kind of non-white to white historical narrative, and it's always sort of this liminality or conditionality, we're sort of like always, Jews are always on the brink of losing their whiteness or something. I wonder if you could speak to your approach, sort of what has informed it, and especially if you could speak to this assertion you made at the end that I find so fascinating, that we must think of white Jewishness as constitutive of whiteness, right? That white Jews are not these passive objects deemed white or non-white by others, but actually participate in the active construction of whiteness as such.
Sure. So I would say that all of this kind of evolved over the process of writing first the dissertation and then revising it into the book. And the scholarship about Jewish whiteness, including the scholarship that has more of this approach to kind of track a transformation from non-white to white, has been really instructive and helpful in understanding certain dynamics. But I would say that one of the kind of foundational reasons for using this terminology of white Jewish involves the danger of obscuring the existence of non-white Jews, of Black Jews, of Asian Jews, not only today, but historically, right? And that piece is something that even if there are many of those histories that need to continue being written, right? It's important that work be done, and part of what allows for that is not kind of continuing to use language that may obscure that existence. So in terms of the reading that I did and what was really helpful, reading works by Matthew Fry Jacobson and Charles Mills, Karen and Barbara Fields and Nell Irvin Painter really helped me to think about how you can have a varied whiteness, you can have kind of hierarchies within whiteness, but still have groups, including white Jews, that are kind of operating as white in terms of how certain power dynamics might function, and certainly how we might think about power dynamics within Jewish communities among white and non-white Jews. So to kind of briefly kind of step away to a different project, on a similar timeline to the last set of revisions for this project, I was working on an article on the Yiddish literary critic and public intellectual Shmuel Charny, whose pen name was often transliterated as the slur often euphemized as the N-word. And Charny's Yiddish spelling of that was the same spelling that would show up in the Yiddish press for instances of that kind of transliterated Yiddish slur. So sometimes transliterated as a word that non-Yiddish speakers were using, but also at times as a word that Yiddish speakers would utilize. And while there's its own conversation about the politics of Shmuel Charny using that pen name, what I found doing that research is that the manner in which that language was deployed in Yiddish and English language coverage of Black Americans subjected very much a kind of white subjectivity on the part of the Yiddish writing Jewish authors, and also that there were in the Yiddish press and in the English American Jewish press articles on occasion about Black Jews, although the manner in which those articles were written suggested sometimes that this was something of a point of fascination or something unusual, and so it was always someone that claims to be a white Jew, but that claims to be a Black Jew, but how could this be? Is kind of the tenor of some of these articles, and that to me is indicative of something that speaks to the fact that even then there was this real attempt on the part of those individuals documenting this to kind of create these delineations, right, and to suggest that Black and Jewish could not simultaneously inhabit the same body, in order to I think conduct this work, especially in the context of theorizing, right, aspects of race as it involves Jews. It's really important to be specific about which Jews we are talking about and who might not be included in that kind of formulation. And then the kind of piece that I will kind of connect with the Shmuel Charney research is that his brother Baruch Vladek is writing as early as 1911 about white privilege for Jews. He uses the term Weiße Privilegien in an article for the Vorwärts, and is writing about how white Jews in Norfolk, Virginia were sympathetic to non-Jewish white people who were beating Black people during the Johnson Jeffries riots. And so so I think that for these reasons, using this language was important for me. There's a kind of footnote in the introduction that kind of speaks to a little bit of the scholarship that kind of gets me to that point. But I think in terms of how I wanted to then conduct the analyses, it was fairly important to be precise. And there's also just a danger in terms of not being precise, right? So the term white passing, there's danger with that term because it's kind of co-opting a term that refers to a very specific African-American historical occurrence, right? That had instances and risks of violence and loss of family ties and kinship associated with it. And so kind of using that term, again, risks, or doesn't risk, but it can obstruct that history and or kind of minimize the very different ways that these sorts of passing can occur if we think of both as passing. Yeah, I mean, and then the final piece of what you were saying there in terms of how this notion of it being constitutive. I'm double checking on my own language there.
I would say that it's constitutive, yeah.
Constitutive of whiteness, right? Because I think that too often there's an inclination to think that there's a particular like white way of doing things, and then there are like other ways of doing things that can happen, and like because Jews are not really white, it can't be thought of in that fashion. But in fact, I think the relationship is more complex than that, and I think that for example, when white Jews kind of call upon a history of vulnerability to anti-Semitism, that is a process that is historically accurate, right? In terms of thinking about the history of persecution of Jews, but in a contemporary political context in which there are so many ways in which we can see white Jewish men embodying a form of whiteness, right? I think that the specific way that's calling on a history of vulnerability can sometimes be cynically utilized by whiteness more broadly to suggest, oh, well, if white Jewish people have this history of vulnerability, then white people as a whole also have this history of vulnerability, and there's a danger in that kind of slippage occurring. And my sense is the best way to kind of combat that is to be as attentive as possible to how these dynamics can operate.
Yeah, that was, I mean, that last point I think was one of the most interesting things that you really argue, that, there is this kind of transference, like, once, you have a white Jewish man and they're being treated as, vulnerable to anti-Semitism, by virtue of their white masculinity, that vulnerability becomes sort of, in a way, like transferable to other white men, and other white men can sort of like draw on that, right? And I think that was something so fascinating of showing kind of this word constitutive that you used, or even just like the contribution, you could say, of white Jewish men to white masculinity at large, which is fascinating. But just to draw out some of the things that you mentioned that I think are really important, you know, the turn to scholars like Charles Mills and Matthew Fry Jacobson and Nell Irvin Painter, I think is really key, because I think it suggests the importance of interdisciplinarity to these questions, right? These are not scholars who are really situated in Jewish studies, and their comments on Jews, if any, I don't know if Painter addresses Jews, are sort of secondary or marginal or combined with other ethnic groups, right? And the importance of seeing that kind of diverse social field when we want to understand Jewish racialization, right? And not necessarily having a kind of exclusive sort of Judeo-centric focus. And the other thing that I think is really essential that you address is sort of how, you know, regardless of kind of top-down legal classifications, there's also a sort of social level where whiteness is constituted, right? And so regardless of how a state may see someone, right, on the ground, as you mentioned, with sort of supporting non-Jewish white people rioting, right, or harming other Black people, right, that as like sort of a practice that constitutes whiteness, regardless of how sort of the powers that be might organize the classification. So I think that's really interesting. But to get to that, what you just sort of mentioned in terms of the importance of thinking how these different forms of racialization sort of interlock and mutate, I wanted to ask specifically, maybe bring it to a specific example in the book, on your chapters on Woody Allen, and that there's sort of a white, Jewish, Asian triangle that you analyze vis-a-vis Mia and Dylan Farrow, Woody Allen, and then Soon Yi Farrow. And it's fascinating to me because I think it does expose some of the complex ways that different forms of racialization interlock, mutate, and transform each other, right? And are relational. And it's not, we can't just say, you know, white versus Jewish and then white versus Asian as necessarily kind of like separate discourses. So for example, Allen appears comparatively white, you demonstrate, vis-a-vis Soon Yi, whose Asianness provided opportunities to sexualize her and present her as sort of the seductive agent in their relationship, absolving Allen of wrongdoing. And yet at the same time, the Catholic pharaohs, and then I'll quote you here, you say, quote, mitigated the extent to which Allen could appear simultaneously Jewish and white, end quote. Right, so I think this is really important because there's a tendency to say, well, you know, compared to the pharaohs, Allen appears Jewish and therefore not white. There's this assumption that whiteness and Jewishness are constitutively incompatible, right? But you're really saying that it is in fact the simultaneity of Jewishness and whiteness that is put into question by Pharaoh's Catholicism, not Allen's status exclusively as a white man. So it's not a seesaw between whiteness and Jewishness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea of simultaneity is really important, even though it suggests that the logic isn't entirely consistent in terms of what Allen is doing. But I think that's part of how we can recognize just how fundamentally he's benefiting from white male privilege in telling a story that really doesn't hold up in these interviews that suggest he is really getting his say about, you know, how we see some members of his family as members of his family and others as not members of his family. And there's a moment in the book where I refer to an interview he's giving with Steve Kroft on 60 Minutes, where he's trying to draw attention to the prospect of Mia Farrow having baptized their kids. And so it's a way in which he is kind of alluding to, right, his identity as a prominent Jewish figure, and the fact that now these children are no longer Jewish because of something that Mia Farrow has done. But he can't use he can't use our, he has to say the kids, because that group of kids included both his legal kids and their siblings, which included Soon Yi. And so you kind of see this evidence of where some of these holes are, right, in terms of how he is putting together a logic where he gets to kind of present himself as distinctively white in one context, so that we give him credibility, right? But also intimate that he's not as white as the Pharaoh in another, so that we're sympathetic as viewers with him. The piece that was really helpful for me with that particular chapter involved Zenita Fenton's legal theorizing about how incest and quote unquote miscegenation were legally facilitated in the context of slavery. And that white men in those kind of familial contexts were given broad leeway to kind of designate, based on their, again, subjective statement, who was their child and who wasn't their child, in the context of them owning their children in the event that they had a child born of rape of an enslaved woman. And so part of what I'm attempting to suggest with Alan is that in this kind of relatively recent context of the 1990s, right, that there's a long history building up to that moment of white men being given an enormous amount of latitude in terms of designating for any audience who is their child and who is not their child, and what their rights are in the context of their families. So this is, and I guess this is where I kind of close this point, is that it's the logical gaps in what Alan is kind of consistently putting forward are not small. And it is in some ways almost a kind of flexing quality in which he is putting them out there in this very defiant fashion, right? That with Soon Yi, it was never a family. And yet, in terms of Mia Farrow, she was taking Alan's family away from him. Those things don't really align, but that is the kind of thing that it takes a man confident in their whiteness to kind of argue that with a complete straight face time and again, and then not more than a decade or decade and a half later, you have interviews with him where he will comment on, it was the paternal quality that attracted Soon Yi to me, and it's just kind of mind-blowing, but at the same time, I think speaks to how particularly aware I think Alan, or his sensitivities as a storyteller to what he could get away with in terms of the narrative that audiences might allow for him to craft.
Yeah, that point about this sort of connecting it to this kind of slavery dynamic, I think, is so fascinating, right? And that this not necessarily the notion that we may be more familiar with of sort of the sexual prerogative of white men to violate whomever they please, but how sort of not just that, but actually the decision of who is or isn't their child actually plays into that, right? And that it's not just necessarily this kind of wanton sexuality that they're afforded, but this kind of paternal authority, right, to determine who is or isn't, that combines with that. So I think that's really fascinating key. It brings out sort of the relevance, obviously, of white masculinity here as a located kind of identity. One of the most interesting aspects of your argument for me, and I think to anyone who is interested in questions of anti-Semitism and also questions of anti-anti-Semitism today, is how you demonstrate really that the integration of Jews into whiteness and cultural discourse functioned and still functions essentially as a form of anti-anti-Semitism, right? And this is not in the sense that, you know, in sort of like this post-Holocaust sense that the West realized its error in excluding Jews from whiteness and now is going to, you know, have this benevolent gesture of inclusion, but rather in the sense that Jews themselves, like the second wave Jewish feminists that you discuss, put forth Jewish whiteness implicitly or explicitly as a protective mechanism. and I'm just going to quote you here because I think it's so important, quote, second wave feminism's consequential integration of secular Jewish identity into whiteness essentially protected Jewish men from ethno-racial pathology, establishing the terms for subsequent discussions regarding Jewish white figures and incest, and helping to displace that pathology onto Black men. So, end quote. So because of the sexualized history of anti-Semitism, Jewish men are positioned as sort of exceptionally vulnerable and in need of protection from charges of sexual deviance. And then this sort of, in turn, this protection works to displace such stereotypes onto Black men, right? So it seems that what you call secular excommunication, this kind of sort of wholesale whitening and evacuation of a person's Jewishness, becomes an unlikely route to like this specific kind of Jewish whiteness, right? Where the displacement of pathologization of white Jewish men, the pathologization of white Jewish men is displaced onto Black men, right? And so this, it seems to me, has broad consequences for how we understand, I mean, obviously questions of Jewish whiteness and race, right? And Blackness and anti-Blackness, but beyond that, right, how we understand Jewish individual and communal responses to anti-Semitism, right? And anti-Semitism's role in the book and in discourse in general. I was wondering if you could speak more about this kind of form of anti-Semitism that seems to depend on whiteness, and what it might suggest for anti-racism at large, and how we think about anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness together.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I think in some ways what might be helpful is talking a little bit about how that chapter kind of came into being. And it began with reading Shulamith Firestone's book in Laura Briggs' class on feminist theory at UMass, and kind of remembering as I was reading, noticing like a footnote aside about Orthodox Jewish community and education, I think, came up, and it was just kind of like there in the footnote. Otherwise, really nothing else in Firestone's text. But then, not long after that, reading Susan Faludi's article in the New Yorker about the incredibly difficult relationship between Firestone and her father, who was very much a patriarchal presence and very much kind of a Jewish patriarchal presence in the context of the home that they grew up in, and thinking about, you know, none of that shows up in the book. And then kind of reading through Susan Brown Miller and kind of expanding to some other texts, and just thinking about how are we learning about Freud, and what does it mean that he just doesn't show up as Jewish in these texts, even as these texts are fairly consistently utilizing arguments about how a male father figure that is kind of exposed to societal bigotry may then, because of that, become a patriarchal figure kind of domineering in their household, but only in the context of African Americans. And then you know, the kind of stark contrast of the fact that like Betty Friedan actually like makes a very brief allusion to Freud and Freud's father, I believe, with that framework, but then it's just kind of like it's gone after that, and so it's a different way of thinking about like an approach toward anti-Semitism, right? Because it's not to kind of approach it and deconstruct it and speak to what is wrong, right? With the idea of like pathologizing broadly a group of people based on kind of circumstances that can have any number of impacts, and certainly not determinatively, right? The idea that these men will then become domineering patriarchal figures. But it ends up being almost an endorsement of that idea, as long as it can then be displaced onto this other group. And so in that sense, it is, I guess, an anti-anti-Semitism, right? Because it's a way of kind of like moving around, avoiding something, but not a productive one, right? It's an anti-anti-Semitism that actually is done with the idea of, well, let's just kind of create space for this group in the kind of protective embrace of like white supremacy, by further othering those folks that we're deciding are not white, not deserving of that protection.
Yeah, and I mean, I think interestingly as well, you even demonstrate, and I believe it was with Friedan, that there's there was this suggestion that even anti-Semitism was the cause of Jewish male sexual deviance or patriarchy, right?
Yeah. So Friedan makes this kind of reference to the I mean, it's really just kind of this brief encapsulation of arguments that are kind of expanded upon by a decade later by some of these other authors who are kind of engaging more in the othering of Black families. But Friedan says, like, Freud's she's basically saying that there are limits in what Freud says, but we shouldn't be surprised by these limits because there's the kind of patriarchal culture that he was a part of in Europe at that time, but also within that, the patriarchal culture of his Jewish household, and the fact that this was a tradition in which, and I think she mentions the kind of infamous blessing, thanking God that I was not made a woman, or something to that effect. And what's interesting is that phrase then kind of has this like recurrent life in the women's movement as by the time the early 80s kind of roll around, as like evidence of anti-Semitism perhaps within the women's movement, which is just kind of a curious journey, given the what I believe is kind of the original moment it shows up, which would make sense that it might be in Friedan's text in terms of a documented place associated with that political.
Well, that's very interesting because, I mean, I don't want to belabor this too much, but that point that you just made is very interesting because it suggests a certain kind of, like over time, secular excommunication of the Jewish feminists because they're like this trope of that blessing, which originates among Jewish feminists, right, ends up getting characterized as just this sort of obsession of white feminists who are possibly anti-Semitic. Is that right?
Yeah, and the other piece here is that through the decade, there's also the question of Israel-Palestine, and the way that the threshold for what might be considered anti-Semitism among some feminists and feminists of color in particular tends to be where is the stance regarding Israel and Palestine. Yeah.
So then, this is, I think, a good segue to ask you is to speak actually a bit more about this concept, this really generative concept I think you have of Jewish communal protective politics. It really is, I think, rather interesting and useful. And you spoke about it there in your introduction, describing it as a kind of impulse and unorganized practice of protecting the image of Jewish masculinity. But I guess I wanted to ask you, I'm curious what you think is the ground of this impulse and practice, right? Like, where does it come from? What is its motor? Are these institutions? Are they individuals? At times, it seems even scholars are participating in this in the book. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the most, the thing I'll preface all of this with is the reason I stress this idea of it being unorganized and impulse, and I'll kind of get into that more, is that the alternative, I just want to stress that this isn't the case. This is not something conspiratorial. This is, I think, something that's actually quite understandable if we kind of imagine a body of individuals that are engaged with Jewish community and are aware of the histories of stereotype and anti-Semitism, and what does it mean for there to be this kind of confrontation with the possibility of someone confirming a particularly horrible, egregious anti-Semitic stereotype. And what I kind of venture is that it's understandable, right, to think that Jewish men and Jewish women in those circumstances might prefer to believe, oh, this can't be true. This is more likely to be a false accusation, because if it's not, right, if this is something that actually happened, then that would indicate that there is an instance of truth to this horrible anti-Semitic stereotype that has done incalculable damage historically. And so I kind of want to engage with that as an idea because it's an understandable impulse, even as it's an unproductive and dangerous one, right? Because it's unproductive because it does not in any way act as protective, right? To suggest that individuals who are alleged to have abused those that they have power over are simply, not guilty of that act because it would be too upsetting and harmful to kind of consider it. So it's on the one hand not something that would. It's something that kind of creates a circumstance for those that are vulnerable to kind of continue being vulnerable, and that by giving voice to it as a phenomenon allows for, I would hope, more discussion of it, because with more discussion of it, then you can kind of perhaps get to a point where it's easily recognizable as not a good piece of evidence, right? Like to say that Woody Allen didn't do it because he's a Jewish icon and filmmaker, and wouldn't it be awful, if that was something that he did? That's not going to be in any way helpful in discerning and kind of considering actual evidence as to what people might testify to or speak to in fashions that are more perhaps telling of what powerful men of any race, ethnicity might do.
So that's really helpful, because I think when I was first reading it, I was somewhat, when you refer, for example, to Allen's scholarship as participating in this, right, it sometimes threw me off to say, well, wait, are these Allen scholars even a part of a Jewish community? But now I think I really understand, what you're saying, and that's actually the point, is that actually it has nothing to do with necessarily a Jewish community dictating things, right? And even non-Jews can participate in this kind of impulse, right? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, and I think that idea of the white Jewishness and its kind of transitive properties are helpful here, right? That in his multiple iterations in film and literature of these particular types of masculine protagonists, right, that spoke to men and women of various different kind of cultural backgrounds, because it was a version of masculinity that was decisively different than, like, thing of the 70s, whether it's Robert Redford, or in the 80s and Tom Cruise, right? This was something that was distinctively not that in terms of what Allen was putting forward. And I think this appealed widely. There's a quote from a biography of Allen's that I mentioned in the book, where I think it's a French cab driver who says he likes Allen because Allen can't get laid, he's just like me. And that particular version of Allen's masculinity is so fascinating, because if you look at Allen's films, it's nothing but these kind of sexual stories of him getting the girl, so to speak, right? And later in the films, cheating, and so there's a masculinity that was not kind of the mainstreamed type of masculinity that Allen kind of put forward in this Jewish figure, but it was still pretty toxic in terms of what we see in those films, dating back to the earliest ones.
Right, right. So that like, and that's, I think, really key, you know, especially in sort of discourses around toxic masculinity, which probably oftentimes rely on, you know, a kind of like cowboy or superhero, you know, hyper masculine
Yes,
is
right.
what usually thought that toxic masculinity means. And then sort of you're bringing out sort of actually how there's something even more sinister about the kind of, you know, the way in which this sort of schlemiel performance can mask or absolve, right, some of those other toxicities. So then maybe now, just to sort of open outward from the book just a bit, your research in American popular culture also seems to connect strikingly to some other contemporaneous research in American Jewish history. And I'm thinking, for example, of Lila Corwin Berman's The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, her recent book, which suggested similar structures and perhaps actually, you know, more organized and intentional, I would say, than what you're describing. Similar structures of kind of control and protection that ultimately failed to confront the undemocratic structures of, in her interest, and her interest is in wealth accumulation, that Jewish institutions are implicated in. But her discussion of Jewish communal treatment of people like Bernie Madoff seems most pertinent to your research, because what she reveals is how Jewish communal treatment really cast Madoff as this kind of aberration, rather than sort of a perfectly normal representative of financialized capitalism and philanthropy. And also Berman's and many others today, discussion of Jewish institutional investment and notions of, quote, Jewish continuity, which seems to link also to some of the issues of Jewish masculinity you discussed. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit to how Jewish communal protective politics, as you say, in the cultural terrain, in American popular culture, might relate to other kinds of defensive impulses and practices in Jewish communities and institutions at large.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading through Lila Corwin Berman's chapter on Madoff, and thinking about just how the kind of thorough scapegoating that occurs with Madoff is distinctly different from
Yes.
the phenomena that I'm kind of identifying in terms of excommunication or denial of guilt, and denial of guilt was not going to be an option with Madoff, and I'd be interested. It would require kind of diving into archives a bit, right? But you know, were there moments of kind of excommunication style commentary surrounding Madoff? I would imagine that might have occurred, but even if not necessarily the case, my sense is that the dynamics that Corwin Berman's getting at in terms of like protecting this banking institution, right? That had grown to that point and would continue to grow, right? It actually served that purpose fairly well to completely just set Madoff up as this kind of exception to a rule of good management and kind of liberal progress. So it does, I think, part of what I really admire about her book is the extent to which she is so carefully and persuasively kind of going through the kind of systemic and institutional. In my work, I'm not doing as much of that particular kind of work. So it's a really kind of exciting model for me to kind of think about and read through. But the other piece that just comes to mind as a connection, right, is that in Blue Jasmine, Woody Allen casts Alec Baldwin as his Madoff type in one of these films that kind of allows for, in this case, Cate Blanchett to be kind of a Mia Farrow surrogate. But it's a very de-Judaized Madoff if we've got Alec Baldwin playing that role. So it's interesting seeing how, and this is pre-Me Too, Allen makes a movie kind of commenting on the Madoff stuff, and that's kind of addressed as commenting on the Madoff stuff, even though in my reading it's really another moment of his providing filmic fodder that deals directly with his own incest narrative. In terms of the Jewish continuity piece, Yeah, I mean, the Jewish continuity piece, as I understand it, has so much to do with this kind of idea of endogamy.
Right.
And close endogamy is often kind of the terminology for like cousin relations, which sits on that kind of border with incest anxiety. And you can kind of go back to Carl Abraham in 1913, I think, writing about the kind of tension between close endogamy and exogamy. And certainly Werner Solers and other folks in American studies kind of theorize how these anxieties are often confused, right? And this kind of goes to what Zenita Fenton gets at as well, right? Like if you're, for slave owning white men in the South, their daughters born of rape were Black, so they were in an outgroup, they were exogamy, but they were also their daughters, right? So close endogamy. And then if we look at, it's really something that you'll find in a number of Woody Allen films, is a different version of that, where you have a sister-in-law or an aunt that is not related by blood, so that person can be, in the kind of parlance of so many Allen films, a shiksa, right? That is also a member of your family, and thus the taboo is endogamy. It's close endogamy rather, but it's also exogamous. So much of Corwin Berman's work, Karen McGinnity's work, Ronit Stahl and others have been kind of getting at how these Jewish continuity narratives, the scholarship really is about controlling women's bodies and kind of finding value in Jewish women as vessels essentially for the next generation of Jewish children. And so this is something that in the literature, it's striking to me how much of what is considered canonical Jewish American literature involves Jewish men in kind of exogamous relationships, and yet how little of what is considered canonical Jewish American literature involves Jewish women in exogamous Jewish relationships. The example that kind of comes to mind is something like Fear of Flying by Erica Jong, which is, a very recognized, important second wave feminist text, but is much more rarely thought of as a Jewish American literary event. And I imagine that may have something to do with Erica Jong's last name being a Chinese American last name because of her intermarriage, and that the narrative itself in the book is a fictionalized version of a Jewish intermarriage, but not the type, right, that is so much more commonplace, involving a white Jewish male subjectivity. But I am, yeah, I mean, I think that the importance of the work that's been done, and the bravery of the woman coming forward and talking about the problematic context of this kind of Jewish continuity conversation that Corinne Berman kind of addresses in her scholarship, and that we find elsewhere, is vital. I'm aware of the recent AJS statements about this, and kind of evidence of the extent to which this work, very important work, is being done, and there is pushing back, and then it's more pushback, and then it's kind of constantly there's a real struggle occurring with all of this, but my sense is that there's a lot of persuasive stuff being written right now that I think we are all very much need to be attentive to, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think I asked you a tough question, thinking broadly about a lot of things, but it was really quite a fascinating and important answer. So I think we're close to out of time. So I just want to thank you again on behalf of the Levy Center for being here today and participating in the Arnold Band Distinguished Lecture in Jewish Studies. And for everyone watching, I'll remind you that this fantastic book, Unsettling: Jews, Whiteness, and Incest in American Popular Culture, is available wherever books are sold. So thank you again, Eli, and thank you to everyone as well.
Thank you, Ben. This was delightful. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.